Hello and welcome. You're listening to the American Interest Podcast with me, Richard Aldous. My guest this week is Tara Isabella Burton, author of the new book Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. Tara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm delighted to be here.
So congratulations on the new book. So why are we living in a godless world?
Well, it's a trick title. We're not, or at least that's the argument the book takes. So I'm interested in Strange Rites in making the case that the contemporary American religious landscape is not more secular as it might appear from the from the statistics that about a quarter of Americans now say they have no faith. 36% of millennials born after 1985 and Generation Z. But just because these people do not say I affiliate with a traditional organized religion does not make them secular at all. Rather, we're finding a much broader phenomenon, that of remixing and reimagining religion, in which both the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S nuns, and people who do profess a faith but still practice a much more eclectic tradition in reality than they do on paper, are together kind of heralding a landscape where spiritual identity is becoming increasingly individualized. We're mixing and matching practices. We might do a bit of yoga, a bit of sage cleansing, go to Christmas and Easter services at church, and so on and so forth. We might practice Zen Buddhist meditation, or at least an app that's inspired by Zen Buddhist meditation, but also identify as Jewish when it comes to families and communities. And we may blend traditional religious practices with what was once called New Age practices. About 6 in 10 Americans, according to a 2018 Pew study, say that they subscribe to at least one belief that is commonly considered within the New Age spectrum, such as belief in psychics or astrology. So I'm really excited to write about this world. I write about everything from wellness culture and SoulCycle and CrossFit to the rise of modern occultism and the witch movement as a political as well as a spiritual force, to the atavistic right and followers of kind of pop self-help gurus like Jordan Peterson. And altogether, I think they represent a new, bit exciting, a bit terrifying, great awakening in American religious culture. Often we talk about the development of the printing press and the development of the Protestant tradition as intertwined, the way in which we consume by reading a book privately, inwardly, reflected in the wider theology. If that is true, I would also make the case that this new religious landscape is the landscape of the internet and internet culture.
Yeah, and you have a great phrase for this. You describe this new category as the religiously remixed.
Yes.
I mean, there's and you define kind of. I mean, one of the things actually that's very interesting about this book is that you do draw on the insights of a lot of religious scholars, Durkheim and so on. But it's very clever the way that you sum up the key elements of religion. You say which are meaning, purpose, community, and ritual. But you then kind of go on to show how actually these things could also apply to, say, a yoga class or something. And I guess that gets to the complexity of this religiously remixed category.
Yes. I mean, I will say, as a bit of a caveat, that the sort of elements of religion identify are necessarily reductive. You know, there is no established single definition of religion or of its elements. But that said, I think that in trying to divide religious life into these components, I also want to reflect the fact that the boundaries between religion, community, cult, activity, subculture are themselves fluid and also reflect the variety of ways in which people approach religion. One could say, for example, someone who goes to a yoga class for a sense of spiritual well-being and to see their friends and be part of a community isn't religious because they don't believe in the metaphysics behind it. But what does that mean for, plenty of people who might call themselves Christian and go to services to see their friends and see their family and do what they've always done, but might not themselves have a relationship to the truth claims of that faith? And I think that those fluid boundaries especially in an era where we are so often mixing and matching. We are so often individualizing other elements of our identities. For example, reading certain newspapers to get a certain perspective on the news, buying from certain stores, and otherwise kind of tweaking our civic life, our consumer life, but into creating a kind of individualized, bespoke world. Spirituality has very much, like these other elements of our lives, undergone the same transformation. We, or Americans more broadly, do tend to mix and match, pick and choose, say, I want to build my personal spiritual identity based on these practices I like. I might get my sense of ritual from this practice, and my sense of community from this group, and my sense of meaning from this political affiliation.
I mean, there's obviously been kind of pushback. I noticed actually very specifically that leaders of the Greek Orthodox Church this week have been talking in quite negative terms about yoga, for example. Because one of the arguments, presumably, that religious figures would make is that this bespoke mix and match kind of way of thinking about religion in many ways is self-indulgent and actually isn't about belief. It is just, as that phrase implies, a kind of pick and mix, take what you like, and that belief, real belief, is actually not about those things.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I do look rather askance at this pick and choose model, in part because of, as you say, it is quite self-focused. But I think it's, rather than thinking, as I think it might be tempting to do, there's a narrative of this of like, oh, those millennials and those Zoomers, and they're so self-focused, and their spirituality is a reflection of that. The way that I would frame it rather is that religious institutions have, I would argue, pretty conclusively failed on so many fronts, whether it is sex abuse scandals, whether it is the kind of politicization we see within the white evangelical tradition, which has become kind of an arm of the GOP. I think there are so many ways in which institutions have lost public trust that the idea of trusting only on yourself, your instincts, your desires, as has been the case at many other points in American history. I think we often see a sort of pendulum between intuitionalism and institutionalism. But I think that this focus of this on the self that we see now comes within the wider framework of like the self is all we can rely on in the absence of public trust. Secondly, I would argue that this kind of pick and choose consumer model is itself so wedded to the wider capitalist neoliberal system in which we find ourselves now, which is to say the idea that our affinities, our desires, our choices define us, that what we acquire, what we do kind of freely or seemingly freely in turn creates our own identity, is at the core of the idea that a spiritual practice can be defined by our choices rather than by our acceptance of or submission to what we see as ontological or metaphysical truths.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as I was reading in the book, I was kind of thinking that a lot of what you're talking about is a rejection of dogma and doctrine and so on. But then you have this fascinating chapter kind of halfway through the book where you talk about social justice, and you ask whether that is a new religion and whether there are doctrines and dogmas that go with that. And that seems to be very timely. I mean, good because the book is coming out at exactly the right time, but very much in tune with current political debate.
Yes, I mean, I've seen before, I think often when people talk about social justice movement as a religion, it's often in this sort of pejorative way, often from a more conservative perspective of saying, those people, they're zealots, they're cultists, so on and so forth. When I talk about the social justice movement as a religion, what I want to capture in that is not necessarily that pejorative sense, but rather to look at why it's so powerful, why it is so meaningful, and what it offers that plenty of other elements of modern life do not. And I think that there is something about both its rejection of traditional institutions, and the sort of systems of power that many in that movement see as having been upheld by those institutions, but also a vision of a new way of being, a kind of eschatological hope for a newer, better world. And that's something that, by contrast, let's say, wellness culture doesn't have. You focus on yourself, you turn inward, you go to SoulCycle, you do a 10-step beauty routine, you drink your purifying water, you get a jade egg from Gwyneth Paltrow and, insert it into your body. And ultimately it begins and ends with the self. Whereas what I think that the social justice movement more broadly has done so successfully, and why it is galvanizing so many people, particularly people in that born after 1985 demographic that is the sort of constitutive of the religious nuns, is to say, not exactly to say doctrines and dogmas as such, but to be able to marry a trust and kind of the individual self with a broader picture of meaning, of purpose. You are fighting for a better, fairer, justice world. And what could be a more meaningful prospect of life, especially in an era where many of us do feel alienated from meaning or purpose, than that.
Although presumably, if we take the example of Christianity, that Christians believe in kind of Christ as the Son of God, but the different churches interpret that in different ways, and that has led to, literally to wars through human history. Those notions of fairness and justice that you're talking about, they are similarly contested, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I think something we see as the movement broadens, as it becomes sort of more politically visible, is that, and there is that sort of stereotype is that of the left constantly fighting within itself. I think the truth to that is that when you are dealing with, as was the case in the early church, dealing with the problem of heresy, when you're trying to kind of work out, give voice to a kind of idealistic notion of how the world should be rather, often the specifics of language, of rhetoric, of how you talk about something, of how you practice certain rituals, all of these becoming intensely charged. It's this sort of odd combination of grand narratives and then these sort of tiny or tiny, but often quite sort of significant, like, do we use this word or that word, this term or that term? For example, this is just one off the top of my head, within sort of certain social justice circles, there's been a kind of shift in terminology from asking for preferred pronouns, as in the pronouns by which a person might wish to be referred, which may or may not accord with their birth sex, to a sense in which the idea of a preferred pronoun is itself, the word is a bad word to use because it implies a kind of willful preference rather than a solid identity. And these conversations, are, one might say, kind of small or dealing with seemingly small issues. But, we have to remember that the Council of Nicaea was in part over the definition of a Greek word for stuff and how we identify and understand. Does ouisa mean essence stuff or substance stuff? And again, these conversations about seemingly small differences in language in what they represent for wider belief are natural.
And that language matters, and that seems particularly important actually in an American context, because America has always had a very kind of legal understanding of language and its association with rights, going right back to the Constitution. And even if we think about debates about gun control, for example, those are very much pinpointed not just on words but even on grammar and syntax and use of commas and so on in the Constitution. So does that seem that interest in language, does that seem particularly American in the context of the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, but I think that's absolutely true, that there is, we do live in, we are very conscious of the way in which words matter. That said, I think a major distinction that I would want to draw here, particularly in talking about sort of what one might call the sort of post-liberal social justice discourse, is a sense in which in terms of like the language of lived experience, for example, the idea that words are not sort of a neutral thing out there, abstractions divorced from everyday life. Often, the language for the idea that, for example, a microaggression can be a form of violence is rooted in this idea that words, stress, trauma, cruelty, even verbal cruelty, affect us physically as well. We are embodied beings whose words are kind of part of that embodiment, such that there's not a clear divorce between sort of language and ideas and lived personal embodied experience. And that's actually something that I would argue is quite, I would draw parallels with the Christian tradition, with a sort of pre-modern, one might say pre-enlightenment, pre-liberal notions of language. And I think that there's maybe a sense in which that, and again, this is sort of a reductionist view of the social justice movement because it is itself quite diverse and these conversations are happening within it. But I think I would identify a general desire to reclaim the idea that language is embodied, that there is not a sort of separate neutral sphere in which ideas can play out without consequence. And I think that was itself also at the heart of, for example, the debate over Tom Cotton's New York Times op-ed. I remember, I think it was Barry Weiss who tweeted about, like, there's this divide in the Times between the sort of classical civil libertarians, she called them, older liberals, and their younger, more woke brethren. And she sort of talked about safetyism and a sort of quite derogatory vision of that. And I think perhaps one could be critical up to a point and fairly about what it means to what a safe space might look like, what safety means. But I also think it's an interesting conversation we need to be having about what actually is language, how does language work, and does language function in a kind of as a neutral vector in society?
Yeah, and it's interesting. We had Ross Douthat on the show. I wouldn't presume to say what he thinks about that particular kind of issue that we were talking about there going on in the kind of times right now. But I mean, this notion of decadence, I was very struck that his ideas of decadence and many of the trends that you identify in this terrific new book of yours might strike readers as decadent too. And there seemed to be a definite overlap between his ideas of decadence and some of the things that you were talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big fan of Ross's new book, and I think he gets it exactly right. He talks early in the book about kind of the cosplay element of, political radicalism that might in the 1930s have been street fighting is here a Twitter flame war. And I think that he speaks there to a sort of crisis that perhaps creeps in at the margins of my book rather than, which is the sense of alienation from purpose, from meaning, from real experience, and a hunger for real experience that is not mediated through our digital, disembodied culture. Again, going back to the question of disembodiment and alienation, that there's a hunger for, and we see this in sort of many of the movements that I would call sort of post-liberal. We see it also, for example, in the atavistic right and the kind of reactionary, like Jordan Peterson-y hunger for like being a real man and eating nothing but raw steak and lifting heavy weights and like slaying a dragon and that kind of language of myth and presence. And I think that where we can sort of see a generational phenomenon, diffuse though it is, and though it manifests itself in vastly politically disparate ways, is a hunger for, desire for real presence combined with a kind of tragic, perhaps even fatalistic acknowledgement that we cannot go back, that we are always going to be mediating our understanding through like the digital sphere, through memes, through kind of the sort of ironic culture of the present moment. I don't know that, unless you go move to a internetless farm in the middle of nowhere, you can get out of that sense of profound alienation. I am wondering, there's a sort of phenomenon that I've seen since Trump was elected, but also basically anytime something bad and surreal happens in the news, the sort of Twitter meme becomes, well, this season of America is terrible. Like, this season of America's jumped the shark. Can you believe the writers added this plot twist? And it's a joke, but I think it reveals something very real, which is the sense of, we are aestheticizing our own destruction, as Walter Benjamin might say.
I just wonder, I mean, you talked about retreating to a farm, kind of moving away from the kind of the real world. Of course, in some ways, that is part of what we've been living through in the last few months with the coronavirus crisis. And that, I mean, in the American interest, for example, there's been the daily email talking, making recommendations about classical music and music of all kinds, in fact, that many people seem to have expressed this willingness to step back from the kind of things that you've been talking about. So I just wonder whether the extent to which you think that the current situation changes the equation, and whether it does so for good or ill.
So I'm torn on this, because the thing is, like, I too have, baked bread during this pandemic. I too, my husband did. I cooked. But I, like many people, have sort of discovered what one might call, or felt an attraction to, a kind of authenticity. That said, we have to think about who has access to that. Those of us who are able to work from home, who have the kind of jobs that allow us to work remotely, that allow us to get on Zoom however many hours a day, are the same people who suddenly have the leisure, because we're not commuting, because we're stuck at home, to rediscover this kind of fetishized authenticity, to take more time to appreciate life. But we're doing that because we can work on Zoom. Someone who is an essential worker, who is going out to a grocery store every day, who is still commuting on the New York subways and risking their health daily, is not someone who has more time, more leisure time in this pandemic. So I think that it is true that perhaps there is a cultural fetishization at this time of authenticity, of somehow making our quarantine more meaningful. It's important to remember that this sort of vision of authenticity is the flip side of a kind of capitalist disembodiment, such that the two kind of reinforce each other. It's sort of this back and forth. We go on Zoom, we have our digital lives, we get that digital paycheck, we spend it on getting flour delivered from via Postmates or Instacart or what have you. And then, yes, we can bake bread in our apartments, but the only authenticity in that we are finding is this kind of manufactured authenticity that requires a very inauthentic, alienating system of labor to sustain us.
And so, and exactly as you say there, I mean, it's very class bound. I mean, if we think about, for example, the educational damage that is being done in communities that need education the most, where perhaps a family might be living in a small apartment, there might not be a computer for every child, and so they can't get online and maintain their education and kind of so on, that the damage that will do will be, will last for a generation. And I just wonder whether that's linked in some ways to the kind of things that you're talking about, that whether it's talking about SoulCycle, for example, and these kind of things, whether what we're actually talking about is a kind of upper middle class, to use that word we used before, decadence in society, and just how damaging that's going to be.
Absolutely. I mean, most of the phenomena in my book are predominantly upper middle class pursuits. They're kind of part and parcel of a certain kind of white collar work under capitalism, like the kinds of jobs where you can take your lunch break and go to SoulCycle on, to give you one reductive example. I think that it is this kind of an alienation, a sense of alienation by people with enough time and sort of free attention to devote to that sense of alienation. I think it is true, I should say, that the demographically, the religious nuns, NONE nuns, are not are pulled relatively steady across racial and class lines. There's not like huge differences in who says they're religiously unaffiliated. That said, I would motion that the sort of particular inwardness of the remixed culture is very much a largely upper middle class, and largely white, although I don't have that, there's not sort of firm data, on that either way phenomenon.
And obviously, when you're talking about religious nuns, you mean none of the above. Those who are rather than those who are living kind of a religious life. As nuns.
The religiously unaffiliated.
The religiously unaffiliated. Kind of finally, a lot of the guests that we've had on over the last year or so. I mean, Patrick Deneen would be a good example. Somebody who's very interested, like you, in the relationship between religion and political philosophy, kind of struggling to see a way forward. Do you still think that the kinds of developments that you've described in the book present a kind of a hopeful future for the United States, or do they leave you ultimately feeling gloomy about what's to come?
Generally, I feel quite gloomy. However, I do wonder, and this has been more, I've been in the light of current events and in the light of the past few months, wondering this, whether sort of our hunger in this sort of alienation for connection might lead us towards an ethos, a politics of solidarity, a vision of the common good that is shared, where we shoulder the burdens of one another, how that moral sense, which I think is a moral hunger that perhaps we are more attuned to in the age of pandemic, although perhaps, again, I'm optimistic. I do think that certainly the idea of the common good, there's a sort of vast political range of approaches to that question. Often we see it sort of from the right in the sort of post-liberal language of the right, from your, integralists onward. But I do wonder more broadly, and I'm coming from a sort of more left perspective from the left here, but whether a politics of solidarity rather than individualism oriented towards a shared vision of the common good might, through the electoral process, through the development of intentional communities and community structures outside the government. I do not know, but I think that there is a genuine American desire for that. I think we are exhausted with our own selfishness, and I think that we are looking for a kind of collectivism. We could, one might, and it's talk about Trump's election as a very specific sort of hunger for authoritarianism within that wider hunger. I might make that case. I'd have to give it more thought, but I think more broadly, we have reason to think that we have reached peak exhaustion with ourselves and are more likely and more willing to focus on our bonds to, with, and through other people. And I hope that manifests itself politically.
Well, the book helps us get over that exhaustion. It's Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. It's written by my guest, Tara Isabella Burton, and is published by Public Affairs. But for now, Tara, congratulations again, and thanks for joining us on the American Interest podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a delight.
So that's it from us this week. Don't forget to check our website, theamericaninterest.com, and to subscribe to the show on your podcast app. The show is produced by Demir Marusik with Sean Keeley. Do join us again next time. But for now, this is me, Richard Aldous, saying thanks for listening.